So hello again. And my name is Shriya Chatterjee, and I'm head of research initiatives here at the Paul Mellon Centre. And I'm here to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of you for joining in person and online. Thank you for being here and being a part of the opening Festival of Ideas for What is Research Now. At the PMC, the Paul Mellon Centre, we've been working hard to make this year-long program a reality. And before I start, I want to thank my colleagues, Ella Fleming, walking up the stairs, Alice Reed, Femi Oloyede, Kathleen Ward, Lewis Johnston, Sarah Turner, and everyone else who willingly and happily make programming like this possible. I feel really grateful to have our speakers from both near and far in the room together. It is in being together, thinking, plotting, and reckoning together that we can make things happen. So, I wanted to start things off with a question. What do we do now? This is something we often ask ourselves in our daily lives when faced with a fork in the road. Election results, the promise of war, losing someone at a turning point in our lives, usually when things are bad. The novelist Isabella Hamad writes that it is difficult in life to pinpoint with any real confidence where a turning point is located. A turning point is something we identify in retrospect. Hamad goes on to write that even if we cannot always know the significance of the moment in the moment, it is also true that our moment, the one in which we now live, feels like one of chronic crisis. Political, economic, and climate crises besiege us, along with other existential crises posed by the exponential development of artificial intelligence and the recurring nightmare of nuclear war. So stepping out of the novel as a form and Hamad's words, but not out of the realities of our time, I want to ask whether acts of creation are, for many of us, turning points. Making a work of art, responding to a work of art, writing something, reading something, organizing collectively. Are these the turning points we turn to when we find ourselves asking, what do we do now? So our turning points then do not come with a promise of resolution. They are ways to work things out for ourselves, with each other. And this year at the Paul Mellon Centre, we want to gather in various constellations to think critically, honestly, and curiously about what we do as artists, humanists, writers, thinkers, people. What is Research Now is a space, a chance to reflect, recalibrate, and try to understand what it is all for. For the next 3 days, the May Festival of Ideas, we will think with two main strands. The first, ongoing Colonial Worlds, asks what research in the arts is under conditions of occupation and unrest. Following Anne Stoller, we emphasize not only a colonial past, but a colonial presence in its tangible and intangible forms, and to acknowledge that there are colonial presents, as those who work in Australia and the Americas would argue, and those concerned with the Palestinian and Israeli context would contend. Thinking and rooted in local contexts with Premesh Lalu, Huda Tayob, Kitso Lynn Leliot, about South Africa, Avinoam Shalem, Nida Sinokrot, and Sahar Kawasmi about Palestine, the conversations zoom in on particular histories, contemporary projects, ideas, problems, and then open out to think reflexively about what they and we do. So the next strand, on looking, remains in conversation with the first one. It shows us that how we look, whether we choose to look, how long we look, changes how we understand the world around us. Can images, as Tina Kampt asks, speak beyond what we see? So yesterday, I Googled the definition of research, just to be sure. And here's what the AI overview gave me. Research is a systematic and creative process of inquiry aimed at increasing knowledge, understanding, or finding solutions to problems. That's a pretty colonial definition in my book. So what can research be? How can it be anti-colonial, feisty, mobilizing, expansive, something that works in the cracks? Can research in the arts enable us to better inhabit the world together? So we are going to be thinking about this all year here at the center, so come back. This is a plug, really. But in the next 3 days, performances by Roxanne Tiara, Solveig Suess, and Kitso Lynn Lelliot will also urge us to think about research as embodied practice. And this is a good moment to flag that Kitso has an installation downstairs in what we've come up with as the little reading room. It is a space to hang out, to think, to chat, to escape from the sun because it's quite cool and dark. And so the books, we hope you'll use it. And the books there relate to the events over the next 3 days, as does the installation. We also have various moments of pause, food and drink programmed over the next 3 days, and look forward to breaking bread even as we share ideas together. So all that remains now is for me to introduce the chair for the first session today. Jyoti Mistry is professor in film at the University of Gothenburg, and I will hand over now to Jyoti. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm totally delighted to be here, and I want to thank Sriya Chatterjee immediately, because some of us South Africans can't find each other because we've scattered ourselves across the world. So it's wonderful to be in a public conversation with two colleagues, if I dare call you colleagues. Pramesh, who I've longed to meet and now have the opportunity, thanks to the Mellon Centre, for bringing us together. And Huda's work, who I've seen from a distance and now will have the occasion to speak with her as well. So thank you very much for bringing us together. And also I'd like to just say thank you to Ella Fleming for orchestrating and making sure that we all got here in a way that was accessible both for online and for the in-person event. My responsibility as the chair is twofold. One is to be sort of the person who gathers questions, observations, and in some ways gives you some kind of summative points as opening for the conversation that will take place at 5:15 today. So that sounds like a long ways away. So what I'd like to propose, please, is if you could take some notes, think about some observations and reflections that you'd like to share, because the way in which the program will run today is that Huda will come up, do her presentation, and then we will have a break. And then when we return from the break, we listen to Pramesh's presentation, and then have a moment of sort of consolidating to very interesting talks, and then open up for conversation and reflection together. So that's the running order of the program for today, and my responsibility then would just be to make sure that we follow that protocol. I'd just like to say 2 comments a little bit about why I'm particularly excited about being the chair for this, outside of like my connectedness with South Africa, is the anxiety around the word research, especially from the current position from which I stand, which is Sweden more than South Africa because of my current position, has been actually about really challenging not only the colonial position of research, but to also interrogate what the impact and implications of research are. So on the one hand is the question and the insistence that we need to do research to reassess, for example, colonial histories, but also to interrogate what is the implications of the implications and implementation of that research output. What consequences does research have? And I'd like you to perhaps contemplate that as we listen to these 2 presentations. And we're in for a treat, because Huda is going to talk to us about ghosts and haunting and all its kind of architectural implications. And Pramesh is going to actually sort of speak in registers of echo with that and take us to puppetry and embodied practices. So I'm really looking forward to the way these 2 ideas can come together. Huda's talk, titled Unconfessed Architecture, under the sort of first strand of ongoing colonial worlds, examines close listening, and I think is going to have incredible resonances with what Tina Kampt is going to say to us later. Examines close listening in the encounters with spatial material and from affective terms in architectural archives. She poses the question, what is the place of ghosts and haunting in the work of forgetfulness? And I think it's a really powerful question in a time when there's so much insistence on remembering, to activate the need for forgetting and forgetfulness. What is the value and the agency of that? So my very short bio introduction to Huda, because there is an extensive biography for both our speakers online. Huda is a South African architectural historian and theorist with several commendations and numerous research awards, where she focuses on migrant, subaltern, and architectural ghost stories, with an insistence on the urgency to rethink architectural cultures. Huda is currently senior research tutor at the Royal College of Art in London, and it's a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you so much for a really generous introduction, and to Shreya and Ella for organizing the next few days. I'm really honored to be included among such an incredible lineup of speakers. So I'm going to speak today about this project titled Unconfessed Architectures. It is an ongoing project that I kind of work on slowly. It looks specifically at Cape Dutch architecture in South Africa, its production in architectural history, alongside the narratives, hauntings, and ghostly footsteps which inhabit these sites and records. I borrowed the title from the novel Unconfessed by Yvette Christianse, which is in many ways how my engagement with this archive began, alongside having studied architecture at the University of Cape Town. In this project, Unconfessed Architectures, starting with a fictional archive, became a means for me to read archival fictions. As Sylvia Wynter reminds us, the myth of history was used by the plantation to secure its power. And this project draws from early architectural writings of Cape Dutch architecture to ask for a close listening to the sounds, size, and pattering of ghostly footsteps within the architectural archive. Listening to these spectral footsteps speaks to the wider imbrication of coloniality and violence, as present and enduring within the materiality of these homes, gardens, and records. In constituting an archive, Stuart Hall argues that in making an archive, the whole apparatus of a history, periods, key figures, and works, tendencies, shifts, breaks, ruptures, slip silently into place. Thinking with Hall and many others, how might we contend with the material that does not typically enter the architectural or urban archive, by caring to listen to these spectral footsteps? The ghostly figure disrupts the linearity of history, revealing slippages and holes, stories of revolt, mutiny, and precarious yet peripheral care. Being attendant to these archival and architectural hauntings asks us to question the production of historical narrations and the limits of both the archive and architecture. And so I'm interested in how we might meet this forgetfulness, these silences and absences. I'm interested in asking of the spatial and material condition of this encounter, and how listening to ghostly footsteps might enable us to contend with the violence of the production of history and the impossibility of certain pasts and futures. With the limits of architecture and the limits of history as a condition of possibility, to draw on Michel Rolf Trouillot. The archival encounter opens questions into the concrete, so I think more generally, into the concrete production of architectural narratives, historical labor, economies of circulation and production, and points to the imperative for us to think through how these histories and narrations work in relation to forms of power. In other words, in what they actually do. So just a brief introduction to the context. Slavery in the Cape Colony was officially the central form of social, cultural, and economic life from at least 1658 to 1834. People were captured and enslaved in Mozambique, Madagascar, Malabar, India, and Southeast Asia primarily, as well as from indigenous Khoi and San communities, and transported to the Cape to work on settler plantations. Slavery in the Cape was largely portrayed as mild up until the 1980s, at least, if not ongoing, and the supposed mild nature was emphasized in a range of popular texts, cookbooks, and paintings, which often depict idyllic scenes of pastoral life on what are plantations. As the poet and scholar Habiba Badroun writes, the colonial city represented in picturesque paintings was founded on slave labor, but these views of Cape Town also rendered that labor invisible. In contrast, she draws on John Mason's research into the office of the protector of slaves to argue that slavery in the Cape enforced a system that exposed women involved in domestic labor to serial violence and systematic sexual abuse. This representation of slavery as mild has become a means to evade the deep histories and hauntings of that violence and of the inheritances in society and space. In looking at architectural archives, this narrative of the mild and bucolic nature of the plantation life is largely repeated, perhaps not surprisingly. However, these submerged histories of violence resurface in fragments, slippages in the text, captions of images, and stories of the sound of violence enacted. As Gayatri Spivak has argued, if in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in the shadow. Spivak draws attention to the impossibility of a full representation or record, particularly in relation to the female as subaltern who was not in a subject position from which to speak in the first place. Yet rather than seeing the inability to know fully as disabling, she suggests recognizing how fiction operates as history in the service of power, pointing to how epistemic violence operates through academic borders and disciplinary mechanisms. For Gyan Pandey, similarly, if the overarching narrative of history belongs to the ruling classes, the fragment is a testimony to both this power and violence and the appropriation of history, but also the possibility of other pasts and other presences. And so in this paper, I read the fictional narrative against the archival grain as the site of precarious life, in a context where the material and linguistic hauntings of these violent pasts is ongoing and ever present. So, Cape Dutch architecture. Cape Dutch architecture most commonly refers to the whitewashed and stuccoed homesteads built in the Cape Colony between the 1650s and 1810s. These houses, usually characterized by a thatched roof, an entrance stoep or veranda, and a dominant central gable, were generally situated on these slave-owning plantations. Groot Constantia, a large homestead close to Cape Town, was declared South Africa's first national monument in 1936. And this moment, and the years that precede it, arguably mark the beginning of architectural history as a discipline and a movement in South Africa. The foundations of this origin moment are laid in the preceding years, with the publishing of what are generally considered the first architectural histories, which chronicle, name, and construct Cape Dutch architecture as significant. Particularly notable among these early texts are two that are often cited and still taught: Alice Trotter's Old Cape Colony, published in 1903, and Dorothea Fabridge's Historic Houses of South Africa from 1922. While the case of Groot Constantia was formed and spurred by a revivalist movement, which was short-lived, the declaration of Groot Constantia as a national monument led to the predominance of this as a venerated style and area of study up until the 1990s, but really still ongoing. Its pristine whitewashed walls and barn-like constructions continue to dominate tropes in architectural education today. So in the early 20th century, as part of this kind of construction of this origin moment, these houses were written into a fictional genealogy of manor houses belonging to landed gentry. These texts produce a seemingly detailed and exhaustive inventory of gable types, architectural joinery, and spatial typologies, alongside a series of stories of the various owners and stories of these homes. Central to this re-scripting is the dual practice of narrating slavery as mild alongside the concurrent erasure of the presence or contribution of slave labor in these homesteads. As Catherine Youssef has argued in relation to geology, and I quote, "Origins configure and prefigure the possibility of narratives of the present," end quote. The origins of architectural history in South Africa establish a material, aesthetic, and discursive space, inscribed with a relationship of power, even if these are very rarely acknowledged as such. History as fiction betrays a nostalgia for a material, ideological, whitewashed colonial past. In contrast to more recognized architectural histories, Yvette Christiance's novel Unconfessed uses fiction as a tool to read into and productively engage the loaded silences of these sites. Unconfessed is set in the Cape Colony around 1822. And it was a practice, and Christianse writes about this, as a practice of looking sideways in the archives, having done over 20 years of research into 19th and 20th century court records concerning Sila, a slave captured as a child from Mozambique, who entered the court records after having been convicted of the unspeakable crime of infanticide. As Christianse writes of this novel, and the kind of background, on December 24th, 1822, a slave woman in an outlying district of the Cape Colony of what would later become South Africa cut the throat of her 9-year-old son. She had, court records later reported, planned to take her own life. Instead, she buried her son in a shallow grave and left the farm on which she was enslaved to walk to another, where she gave herself up. Of her life, we know almost nothing. In the archive, she survives only in the fragmented records and palpable silences of criminal proceedings, recognized under various related names, including most frequently Sila van den Kaap. The novel charts Sila's life across the Cape Colony in a series of homes and as the subject of violent and serial sexual abuse. In the novel, the story of slavery is not separated from the story of architecture and the wider landscape. Instead, the novel reveals an axis of power and performance where architecture, body, and land meet. For the most part, in the architectural histories that I've been referring to, as I've mentioned, we have these hints of slavery hinted at but dismissed as mild, and largely inscribed within an aestheticized landscape. In Fabridge's description of the general features of a Cape Dutch house, she describes the importance of the gables, the stoep, and the veranda that extend around the house. Oh, the stoep is a veranda. And then in a brief description, she makes a note. The wine cellars and slave quarters, which are always found near country homesteads, are frequently very charming. So in this narrative move, slave-owning history of these houses is both mentioned and disavowed. In relation to another house, Fabridge writes, but pleasant, and this is Spear Estate, pleasant as are the shaded rooms of the homestead, the outside is even more attractive. These descriptions of the houses situate them within a wider landscape to be considered of value, including these outbuildings, referring to the various barns and attractive slave quarters. Fabridge's language betrays the omnipresence of slavery, even as it is inscribed within an aestheticized landscape. There is some description of the importance of slave labor in the construction and crafting of these homesteads, yet with limited detail, and similarly often disavowed after being mentioned. In Trotter's Old Cape Colony, among longer discussions of building details, there are short anecdotes which point to parts of building. For example, the homestead Elsenburg is described as follows. The gable, and I'm quoting, the gable, of course, has a late date, and the beautiful side screens of the door were probably made by an Oriental slave skilled in metalwork. And she continues, Febridge's writing contains similar descriptions of the, I quote, deft-fingered Oriental slaves who worked marvels in plaster decoration, end quote. These anecdotal references talk to this centrality without further detail or authorial inscription, and largely overwritten by the master narrative of architecture, led by a designer or owner as patron. Unlike the few architects or sculptors mentioned, these craftsmen are simply marked by the name Oriental slave. And this in itself is simultaneously part of a narrative movement of constructing a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy of slave labor. In the novel Unconfessed, the aesthetic of the gable is similarly present throughout, and yet treated as a personification of the masters of the homes. This is most evident in the passages describing Sila's arrival at her second owner's farm. And I'll read. I saw how the land, the first passage reads, I saw how the land had changed. There were fields. The land bent away into rows and rows of green and more green. The driver cracked the whip, and the whole world cracked. There was the house, not orange but white, waiting like a queen on a wide throne, looking down through a robe of white that curled over itself like the walls through which we passed. Look, the house said, look here. I looked and I could not raise my eyes. The gable is described here as both beautiful and imposing, and is depicted as a queen looking down on the arrival of the new slaves. Sila, in contrast, is unable to raise her eyes. If Spivak asserts that the subaltern cannot speak, here Sila cannot look. The passage is furthermore framed with a violent imagery of the whip, and asks the reader to see the stuccoed walls in relation to this sound. The association continues on the following page. So that was how Omisi's house arrived before me. I saw nothing but the way it bent its walls and made square eyes that looked out and told the trees where to stand, and pushed a long road out from itself, and opened its big brown door. The creaking stopped, but the dogs ran on and barked. The whip cracked and the dogs stopped on their heels. Sila says again that she saw nothing apart from the control of the house over the new arrivals and the land. And again, the description of the house is framed by the auditory imagery of a cracking whip. Architecture's imbrication in the role of ordering and controlling both the landscape and people is further brought out in later passages, which speak to the trauma as invested in these grand houses of the Cape. While an analogy is drawn between the slave master's violence and the house never takes the place of the owner. Instead, it is treated as a central character in its own right, commanding the new arrivals to look, and active in the enforcement of violence and slavery. As with Toni Morrison's Beloved, this is a house saturated with spite. The house tells the trees where to stand and pushes the road out. I'm reading fiction here as a potential way into the story of these houses. To claim to know or speak for the slave woman would amount to a paternalistic recovery of a figure whose interior world cannot be known. In this context, Christianse captures the opacity and ambiguity of this history in Cape Town, evoking a sense of the violent spaces without literal descriptions. The result is a novel that does not attempt to recover a lost story, but rather evokes a space of possible pasts. Spivak asserts that even when the subaltern does speak, we do not know how to hear her. Christianse's novel is a response to silence of archives, a practice of listening to those silences and looking sideways. Of the few archival records found, Of the few archival records found of Sila are the reports by the district surgeon Somerville, written in December 28, 1822, which indicate bruises of a livid colour on the upper eyelid of her left eye. She was only recognized as a person due to her crime of infanticide. Kindermoord. The archives describe and compare their sizes and direction. One is in an oblique direction upon the middle and back parts of the right arm, while another on her left shoulder measures about 4 inches by 2. While the medical record can be read as a trace of this embodied violence, the archive does not contain a full record, and is always mediated by forms of power. So for Brenna Banda, similarly, the colonial encounter produces a racial regime of ownership that persists into the present and into the way that we understand space and sites. It created a conceptual apparatus in which private property remains bound to a concept of the human that is thoroughly racial in its makeup. And in the process, these laws of property, associated language, ways of seeing, and modes of subjectivity render indigenized and colonized populations as outside of history. Christianse writes of Sila as a prisoner in the country of lies. Truth was a foreign language here. In reading Unconfessed, I returned to the archive to listen again to these silences and this forgetfulness. The précis of the archives of the Cape of Good Hope, covering the period 1699 to 1732, begin with these listed items. In the first few days of 1669, there was a New Year's service, fine rains for the abundant gardens, a murder, and deceptive mists. This initial list is followed with longer descriptions of battles and trade, of convicts brought to the Cape, of rumours and intrigue. These carefully recorded daily events are drawn from longer archives and cite the small settlement known as the Cape of Good Hope, somewhere between Colombo, India, Madagascar, Mauritius, the Netherlands, and the British Isles. I turned to these archival records through a search for stories about some of these old Cape houses and their histories. And this précis in particular is cited as one of the most important accounts by both Dorothea Febridge and Alice Trotter. I was searching for traces of a slave ghost mentioned briefly in these architectural histories around a series of houses: Waterhof, Welgelegen, Nooit Gedacht, and Renish. I found very little about any of these houses or their ghostly presences, but I read instead about stories of a troubled land, of mutiny among slaves and soldiers, of desertions and murders, and of fine rains, abundant gardens, and deceptive mists. Waterhof, or Water Manor, is named for the large freshwater spring located on the site in Table Valley. It's described in a few paragraphs in relation to its more stately neighbour, Leuwenhof, as the following by Febridge. Equally blessed in soil and situation, it had a glorious garden not long ago, a garden in which steps of Batavian bricks led you from one terrace to another, in which you lost yourself in the luxuriant tangle of honeysuckle, myrtle, jasmine, and scarlet passionflower. This garden, described as both blessed in soil and situation, is situated at the foot of Table Mountain. The sheltered natural amphitheatre is surrounded by Lion's Head and Devil's Peak, the two mountain peaks, with spring water and fertile soil. The freshwater system feeding the spring was known as Kamisa, a creolized term derived from the Khoi language denoting the 40 tributaries which run through the valley, or sweet water of the people. Yet beyond the description of this abundant natural beauty, Waterhof is a home to a legend, as Febridge writes, which hangs about so many Cape houses. This is the story of a slave mutiny of all the household slaves, with the supposed intention of murdering every member of the family. According to the legend, one child survived at the mercy of a young girl. And she writes, But a young slave girl who had charge of the sleeping baby of the house slipped outside with the child and slid him into the brick baking oven in the yard. As the story goes, the child slept through the noise and the chaos that ensued and survived to hand down this story to his children's children. This passage is followed by another. Waterhof is a place wherein to see visions and dream dreams. Legend says that you may hear the pattering footsteps of the mutinous slaves whenever you care to listen for them. Waterhof is first named on a land registry diagram dating from 1698, 1 year before the Precies records begin. The site was initially farmed as a productive market garden. The valuable springs situated on the land meant the garden was an important site of food production and a key water source. Also a control of this key water source. It's not exactly clear when the house itself was built, but the date may have fallen outside of the archival Precies mentioned. The site was described as having a tuin en gebou, garden and building, in a 1794 transfer. Land registry details and deeds office records are incomplete, yet speak of various owners, a series of expansions and deductions to the land, sales to children, bankruptcies and recuperations. An 1800 tax and property census, notoriously inaccurate, records that the owner had 13,000 vines, 2 sons, 5 daughters, 7 animals, 3 oxen, 4 horses, 16 slaves, 8 men, 5 boys, 2 women, 1 girl. There are no names in these documents, and potentially they were not accurate. Yet the sound of footsteps resonates across time, heard by various occupants of this building until at least the early 1950s in archival records, and I've been told they are still heard. Later in the passage, Febridge writes, "This legend, which hangs about so many old Cape houses, has a home here at Waterhof." Febridge acknowledges the same story in relation, or very similar, in relation to a series of other homes, including Welgelegen and Nooit Gedacht. For Febridge's and Trotter's readers, and they correspond across these two texts, amidst the detailed drawings and genealogical underpinnings of the gabled homesteads and their owners, these passages hold traces of the more violent histories. These houses as always embodied within the ghost of the slave body and her footsteps, marking mutiny as resistance. However, by Febridge's own acknowledgement, these pattering footsteps are only heard by those who care to listen for them. After this note on visions, dreams, and footsteps, the passage returns to describe the gable and general splendor of the homestead, among others. Did only the infant child survive? What happened to the slaves? Did they escape to the surrounding mountains? Were they caught? Who else has cared to listen to this pattering sound? This brief interlude, retold among the beauty of the garden with its Batavian bricks, is followed by a description of the heavy hand of time on these houses, before moving on to a lineage of ownership of similar houses nearby. Yet the ubiquitous nature of these stories and the narrative force of these offhand tales repeated frequently asks to be read again. Amongst whom are these stories told? Who shared these tales? What happened to the young slave girl, and who was the child? These are stories that exceed the architecture, yet are embedded within the brick baking oven, Batavian bricks. They are deeply entrenched in the tangle of honeysuckle, myrtle, and jasmine and scarlet, passion flower, recalling roots. The stories travel across time and space, marking the presence and absence of the lives of these houses and land. The story is not unique to Waterhof. Alice Trotter recounts a similar story, yet attributes it to the house at Welgelegen, or well positioned. where only one baby survived and was similarly saved by his nurse in a brick oven. The House of Nooit Gedacht has a similar tale. In Nooit Gedacht, and I'm quoting, Nooit Gedacht owns a legend similar to that of Waterhof, a tale of mutinous slaves and of the master and mistress returning from a rout at Government House. She in brocade and diamonds, he in powder and satin, to be murdered on their arrival. Here too, in this house named Unexpected, a baby was saved by its nurse. In this story, in a dark cupboard. A third notable account is of Rhenish, which later became a private girls' school. And at the time, it was the only original construction was the rear garden, yet this ghostly presence still returned. And I quote from Fairbridge again. In this garden, rumour says, a slave was murdered by her master, and once a year, when the moon gleams on the white waxen flowers of the myrtle, she wanders beneath the vine-covered pergola. End quote. This is a garden which remains filled with myrtle hedges, mulberry trees, and a tall palm, where the wandering spectral figure returns every year. Amidst the midsummer myrtle bloom, is there something unexpected in this violence? As Fairbridge has mentioned, this is a tale which hangs about so many Cape houses. The sound of her footsteps writes a silence. The ghost is anxiety and a refusal to be forgotten. Nasser Abrahmeh writes on Palestine, arguing that settler colonialism is particularly and peculiarly a fraught struggle over time. And I would argue here, similarly, the ghost's footstep is a sign of rupture of the dispossession of land and person, but also a refusal of historical time. She refuses to abide by the closure of the past into settler futurity. Okay, to draw to a close. To read an architectural history as fiction and fiction as history simultaneously is to understand the archive as always already compromised. The spectral footsteps speak to fear and anxiety, projection and panic of conquest. The haunting offers a temporal refusal of displacement and erasure, and positions the archive as emotive and contested. The slave woman's footsteps are a point of recall and return. No matter how faint her pattering feet might be, she disrupts history and architecture, insisting on the return of time, even if only at times for those who care to listen. She signals the possibility of another kind of historical practice and reading of these sites. As Avery Gordon notes, the spectral is a seething presence, not simply a dead or missing person, but a social figure. Caring to hear these footsteps of these ghostly female presences leads us back into the density of the archive where social life is made and disrupted. As Gordon writes, the present wavers, something will happen. The disembodied pattering, heard but not seen, draws architecture into relation with property, personhood, water and mountain. Perhaps if we care, we might hear. The ghost and her footsteps are not an unmediated carrier of transparent truth, but offer a space from which to contend with history, with the contradictions that survived, the possibilities of return. They appear to fulfill the fragility and instability of the settler presence. These footsteps remain to be heard, and the honeysuckle, myrtle, and jasmine are still widely found. I have more questions. The longer I work on this project, the more I have more questions than answers. How do we write ghost stories of the deep hauntings of these slave-owning homes and slopes, of the embodied violence they continue to hold, of their immaterial permanence and endurance? How and where do we follow the submerged traces of footsteps? The archival précis of 1669 begins with a story of a New Year's service, fine rains for the gardens. A female slave found murdered, at Somerset Hospital, Deceptive Mists on Robben Island. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Primesh's talk is titled Aesthetics After Apartheid, Racism's Last Word and the Work of Art. And the term apartheid and its lived experiences has become resonant and global. In fact, it's been unmoored, I would argue, perhaps, from its geo-historical provenance. And Primesh is going to talk us through some of those ideas. Partly also to interrogate what the role of aesthetic education and the insistence on the sensory can offer us towards a possibility of freedom that divides so many of us. Primesh Lalu is a South African historian and former director and convener of the flagship on critical thought in African humanities at the Centre for Humanities Research. Primesh has an illustrious research and publication career, with his most recent book, Undoing Apartheid, garnering critical acclaim. He currently holds a UKSA Digital Humanities Chair at the University of Western Cape in South Africa, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you share your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. I want to just say a disclaimer to begin with. Don't tell anybody at the British Academy, but I don't know what the digital humanities are about, and I don't know how to use my phone, but please don't convey any of that to them. Sarah, Shreya, Femi, Ella, thank you very much. I know people back home are wondering why you put up with all the madness that I subjected you to over the past few days, including being almost homeless for one night until you've managed to find me a place. I was so enthusiastic, I arrived a day earlier. I'm going to try and persuade you about three things. One, that we misunderstood apartheid, fundamentally. And two, that this oversight, blind spot that inheres in the critique of apartheid has very severe implications for how we might think about a future. And thirdly, I'm going to try to answer the question that was put to us right at the beginning: what do we do now? So it is going to be a little peripatetic, a little meandering, if you like, but I will tell you that we're going to land in a place somewhere, and it's going to be a joyful place. It might be Seamus Heaney's further shore, who knows? So bear with me. So let me just get started. The painting before you is a painting by Francis Danby, the opening of the Sixth Seal. As you know, some of you who've been to the Irish National Gallery would have encountered this work. It is a very vast canvas. It was completed in London. Danby is Irish, but ended up working in the UK. And in every respect, it conveys to me, at least, that it is part of a genre of works that appeared in that period as the abolition of slavery was pending, which I would call an apocalyptic sublime. In fact, there's much to say about this work. Danby sold this work to someone, John Watkins Brett, who ended up touring it around the world. It ended up in New York, and eventually, garnered enough support around the world because it was part of a public display of artwork that had been unprecedented in many ways. In fact, Brett Watkins sold raffle tickets for this painting. And then in 1843, and this is why I'm interested in this work, in 1843, while on display at Rochdale, the newspapers call them gentlemen, walked into the gallery and mutilated the painting. And what they did, and I'm just going to point this out because it's a very dark image, it's very hard to see, but I'm just going to step away for a second. The slave in the center of this painting with arms outstretched to the heavens was cut out of the painting. And what interests me is Danby's return to this work to stitch the slave back into the work of art. And so there's something about the metaphorics of stitching the slave back into the work of art that I want to stay with a little bit in this lecture and also ask you to think with me about. In fact, Danby had very strong abolitionist sensibilities. He was a pro-abolitionist. He fought hard for this for the freedom of slaves. And this work is partly his attempt to translate that moment in 1828 as the end of slavery, the British abolition of slavery, was on the horizon. So the stitching of the slave back into this canvas suggests that the promise of abolition was very, very profound in this moment. There were very strong indications that the new scientific revolution that had taken hold, particularly at Cambridge University with the Cambridge Philosophical Breakfast Club, there are massive interventions that people like John Herschel, who ended up in the Cape to map the southern skies, but also William Ewell and others who had revolutionized the way we were going to see the scientific enterprise. In fact, the word scientist, as we all know, was given to us in that moment of the abolition of slavery. In 1833, it's Ewell who, at Cambridge, at a conference, asks for a distinction between artist and scientist, and the word scientist becomes a career possibility, a specific disciplinary possibility. But there was also confirmation in this moment that the liberal subject was going to hold through the dire panic that had been caused by news and word of the abolition. The best example of this is in New York in 1835. A series of articles appeared in a penny press, a popular press called The Sun, which claimed that John Herschel at the Cape had discovered life on the moon. And there was a huge interest in this paper. They sold large amounts of copies of this newspaper. The idea here, I mean, it's called the Great Moon Hoax. But the idea in my reading is that actually what you find in the penny press is this idea that the liberal subject would endure, that slavery was not reason for panic, and what you have is the moon populated with interspecies life, and so on and so forth. So the abolition had consequences across the spectrum of what we might call the knowledge project in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. Now I want to fast forward to 1994, from 1834 to 1994, and 3 plays by William Kentridge and the Handspring Puppet Company to inaugurate the birth of a post-apartheid South Africa. Wojciech on the Highveld, Faustus in Africa, and Ubu and the Truth Commission provided cautionary tales about the promises of freedom. And they are stitched together, if you like, to use that metaphor, by a strange, ominous formulation by Lesego Rompolokeng, one of the script writers for Faustus in Africa, who says, in one of the lines in the play, "There is no suture for a wound of a slashed future." So I want to just show us a brief clip of the 3 plays so that you have a sense of what the materiality of this performance looks like. Femi? Oh, do I need to?
What's going on, Wojciech? A man of his word?
What do you mean, Doctor?
I saw it, Wojciech. You pissed on the street. You pissed against the wall like a dog, and you get $3.50 a day. We have a contract. That's bad, Wojciech. Very bad.
But, Doctor, the call of nature.
The call of nature. The call of nature? Nature! Haven't I proved that the musculus constrictor vesicae is controlled by the will? Wojciech, man is free. Only in man is individuality raised to freedom. Couldn't control himself. Did you eat your peas today, Wojciech? This will revolutionize science. I'll turn it on its head. Urea, 10%. Ammonium chloride, hyperoxidic. Wojciech, go in there and piss again.
I can't, Doctor.
But you can piss on the wall. I have it in writing. Here's the contract. I saw it all with my very own eyes. You shouldn't have pissed on the wall.
But you see, Doctor, sometimes you've got a kind of character, a kind of structure. But with nature, that's something different. You see, with nature, that's like, how should I put it? For example...
Wojciech, you're philosophizing again.
Doctor, have you ever seen anything of double nature? When the sun is standing high at noon and a terrible voice shakes the world.
Information is the beacon of our enlightenment, but a man is cursed when his information is turned to shine on himself.
Oh, and now it's given me heartburn.
Pudding!
Enough! Secure the rest till later. Yes.
A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. We only make ourselves safe by knowing all.
Another night alone at home. Architect! Is this a marriage? Every night out with his dogs, no one to dinner and no invitations. This is not normal.
As during the question and answer session and in the discussion that's to follow. But what strikes me are two things that we need to perhaps hold on to here. One is this idea of doubling. There's a wonderful anecdote in Cape Town told by Abdullah Ibrahim, the jazz musician, who says that people in Cape Town never say they're going to see a double feature. They're always going to see a double future. And there's always a sense of something ominous, something looming, something that is going to reappear. Perhaps Freud's Uncanny was written specifically with South Africa in mind. But the second is perhaps also to think a little bit about what subject of apartheid has been constituted in the imaginary of political formations, but also in the post-apartheid as the remains of apartheid. And I want to suggest that this is a question worth pondering, because there's a lot in these questions that might give us a different way of thinking about the problem of apartheid. So the question really is how to locate this repetition compulsion in the desire for post-apartheid. Mostly, I've been arguing in the lecture that I just did a few days ago that we ought to be thinking about how apartheid was also about the technical becoming of the human, and that it had within it an apparatus that put in place a way of creating forms of labor efficiency, but also marshalling the everyday towards the ends of a certain kind of mechanical form of life. And so there is something about its assault on the senses that gives us a way to think about what it put in place as a process of a mechanical form form of life. And here I'm going to point to some of the reasons for thinking about apartheid as a particular kind of administrative rule that has the mechanization of life at its core. The second is to ask more, and I'm going to emphasize this point today, is what was rendered as willfully forgettable, or I'm going to use a term that doesn't really exist, unpolitical, not apolitical, but outside of the frames of anything that needed to be considered in transcending from apartheid into the post-apartheid. So the answer to this question, to this double bind, if you like, might lie in what is willfully forgotten in the experience of apartheid and therefore quarantined as unpolitical. There is a reminder, however, on why it is that this question is so important for us now. Because apartheid, in many respects, is not important for what it was as a past. That is crucial, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa dealt with this question very forcefully. But rather also what it says about what is to come. And it is that question that I think has eluded the post-apartheid transition, the question of what is to come. Because that sensibility was part and parcel of the nationalist emergence in South Africa, the anti-colonial nationalism that emerged in the early 1900s. Sol Plaatje, Gandhi, Abdur Rahman, the whole range of people who saw a new form of capital taking hold in the southern parts of South Africa. Now, we have been reminded about this return by several people. There's Jacques Derrida, who in his lecture at the opening of the Art Contra Apartheid exhibition in 1983, with that wonderful essay called Racism's Last Word, suggested that apartheid was racism's last word, and went on to qualify that statement by saying that it was the last of many. But similarly, Stuart Hall, who more provocatively, I think, in 1987 at the Goldsmiths lecture titled Race as a Floating Signifier, pivoted the question of apartheid indirectly on a future in interesting and productive ways. In my reading of Hall, I would say that he invokes the idea of a floating signifier to prepare his audience for the many uncanny returns of race. In so doing, he wants to make race the site of a politics without guarantees, one that is best approached as if structured like a language. And you will recall that in that first moment in that Goldsmiths lecture, he links arms with Kwame Anthony Appiah to say that a biological concept of race is patently over. But at the same time, and that's where he parts company with Appiah, he is wanting us to think about what is left in this signifier that is so pervasive and has a sense of eternal return. So race in this understanding combines with other signifiers in Hall's understanding to create a chain of meaning-making practices. And it is that formulation that I think has helped us to think about what we might want to do with the question of the humanities in the aftermath of apartheid. Hall's reframing of the critique of a racial modernity compels us to reevaluate what we mean by apartheid. I suggest that he's asking us to rethink the very foundations of the critique of apartheid. At the very least, I want to persuade you that apartheid modified the idea of race. Now, this is not an argument for South African exceptionalism. It is an argument for being prepared for a return of race by thinking about apartheid as racism's last word. South Africa, in its transition, appeared ill-prepared for how apartheid had modified this idea of race. While a massive popular resistance movement through courageous struggle and incalculable sacrifice defeated apartheid, much of the reckoning with its legacies were dealt with through the instruments of the law. But this resulted in an act of willful forgetting, as I was suggesting, and a demarcation of what counted as political and what amounted to the unpolitical. That is not worthy of consideration. Perhaps what is willfully forgotten, what fell outside of the tension of the law, was a form of apartheid that I would referred to as petty apartheid. This is an official designation. So apartheid was never experienced as one thing. It was always constituted as two things, almost in the cybernetic loop, as grand apartheid and petty apartheid. And the founding figure, the grand ideologue of this political rationality, Hendrik Verwoerd, often thought of as the architect of apartheid. I would say we need to spare the architects in our midst the insult, and we should actually refer to him as a technician in a recently founded discipline of psychophysics and psychotechnics. That was his first professorial appointment. But that some of this grand apartheid that has become the dominant way in which we interpret the South African predicament and the post-apartheid and its aftermaths and the way in which the signifier now applies to so many parts of the world is by thinking of it within the constructs of law. The problem is that it has no understanding of this texture of the everyday, a banal, everyday form of apartheid called petty apartheid, that engaged in a psychic breach and that perpetually stirred the demos into conditions of civil war. And so what would happen is that petty apartheid would be the place where a provocation would stoke the flames of warfare, internecine warfare. Grand apartheid would then descend on that and create a peace of warring parts. And so there's something about the cybernetic-like quality of apartheid that is often forgotten in our reading of its political rationality. But it was, petty apartheid, a banal, everyday project that targeted the senses, that was formed around an aesthetic ideology, often around the patterning of society, of trying to work out forms of mobility and immobility based on rationalities of the factory that then got transported into society as a whole. And that ultimately, it combined to create a condition of stasis. And that condition of stasis has most eloquently been elaborated by Nicole Leroux in a wonderful book on ancient Athens called The Divided City. In Divided City, Nicole Leroux tells us that civil war is at the heart of stasis, that the political ambition to constitute stasis as the model for how we might think about a democracy is at its heart a way of willfully forgetting those forms of power that reside in the everyday, that willful forgetting of the unpolitical that is always available as a residue of one sort or the other. So despite its diminutive name, petty apartheid, the deceptive plot, and I would say that Verwoerd and others were deceptive political thinkers, it bears all the traces of what the Greeks called apathy, a way of deceiving you into believing deceiving you into believing your racial position in society and your status. And so there's a way in which petty apartheid masks more than it discloses. And what it masks is its deep disciplinary roots in the institutional site of the modern university. It obscures the perspective of how a particular political rationality of apartheid, of petty apartheid in particular, was drawn out of an unfolding sequence of technological and scientific developments within the university. In particular, I'm referring to the birth of the minor disciplines of psychophysics that later also translated into psychotechnics. Now, there's a long history to narrate here. I'll just draw out a few touchstones because it is important for us to understand what the impasse is and where stasis has come to reside in the South African transition. Particularly, I want to draw attention to the founding of experimental psychology from 1870 to 1920, led by someone called Wilhelm Wundt, who had set up a laboratory in Leipzig, in Germany, that became the place where a large number of intellectuals, both in the US and South Africa, who were instrumental in reimagining what labor and race looked like, ended up. So Hugo Munsterberger in the US, but also in South Africa, R.W. Wilcox and a number of others. Wundt's attempt was to apply the revolutions in physics to the measurement of sense perception. And so there was a turn to the kind of philosophy of mind, if you like, to begin a process of disaggregating sense perception, to measure sensory responses and their perceptual traces in the aftermath of particular kinds of stimuli. Erica Fretwell has written a wonderful book called Sensory Experiments, in which she rehearses some of the ways in which this involved a deeply entrenched aesthetic form. In other words, it found ways within the aesthetic to mobilize this discipline. I'm going to, because I'm running out of time, I'm just going to mention a few others. Fechner is the other one, Gustav Fechner, who put art objects into a relationship with the mind, with effects on the mind. And then, of course, as I was saying, Hugo Munsterberger, who was deeply influential on the South Africans, particularly Verwoerd. This psychophysics and psychotechnics arrived in South Africa through the figure of R.W. Wilcox, who set up a laboratory in Stellenbosch University, modeled on the Leipzig laboratory, and in which Hendrik Verwoerd did his PhD dissertation on the blunting of emotions. The blunting of emotions was Verwoerd's stand against those German scholars in the Leipzig lab who had drifted towards Nazism. And what Verwoerd was arguing was that emotions could be studied, they could be compartmentalized, they could be measured, evoked, and manipulated. And so the entire dissertation, The Blunting of Emotions, was an attempt to look at how you might use the space of the emotions to begin a process of instituting a form of a racial division of labor, firstly, but also to translate that into a broader spectrum of society that had been couched as a laboratory. So petty apartheid drew on this disciplinary form that emerged. It was a short-lived discipline, but its consequences and effects were widespread and considerable. Particularly important here is that its origins did not only emerge in the end of the 19th century. It also has traces in the early 19th century, in the period of Danby's painting with the Cambridge Philosophical Breakfast Club. And this is not to assign intentionality to science, but that something in the scientific revolution in the 1830s, which worked around the inductive sciences, the revolution of the inductive sciences, that sought ways of collecting the sensory and making it, stabilizing it within a kind of perceptual field and within a process of verifiability, gave rise to the psychophysics, psychotechnical disciplines that emerged in the 1900s. Now, this is all tedious and, you know, as my students would say in South Africa, it's history. But it does impact on how what that transition in South Africa looks like might have been resting on a form of research drawn out of the inductive sciences, almost unwittingly transferred into the space of psychophysics, and later finding a presence in the realm of cybernetics. Remember, Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics was published in the same year that apartheid was declared an official state project. There's no causal link there, but there is an interesting coincidence and worth thinking about. Perhaps then, the argument I'm putting forward is by willfully ignoring the problem of petty apartheid as a sensory order, the post-apartheid appears to be extending the rule of stasis, so that the post-apartheid might be enacting precisely that which it sought to overturn in the idea of apartheid, by reconstituting stasis as the mode through which the political, but also the relationship between knowledge and desire, that conundrum that is faced by Faust, that they might be reconstituting and reinstituting precisely that condition of stasis. This is a city doomed to divide itself, and in the shadow of apartheid's threat of civil war, it calls for another orientation, another way of thinking. So, at the heart of Whewell's revolution was this idea of the consilience of induction, of knowledge jumping from one field to another and producing a surprise. This is why when Darwin visits him in the Cape in 1836, on the cusp of the abolition of slavery in the Cape, what you find is that Darwin's absolute fascination with the revolution in physics, in the establishment of cause and effect as the grounds for which a new foundation of knowledge is being laid. And what Darwin does on the origin of species is dedicated to the greatest living philosopher of his time. It's John Herschel or William Ewell, is to postpone the point of verifiability. So collecting, this is where science and empire meet. Collecting allows for verifiability in hypothesis formation that arrives much later in the process. And this is, the wonderful example of this is the study on tides in 1835. In 1835, Ewell undertook a massive study, probably the biggest data study in that period, of asking people to measure tides across the world. And this is what shifted maritime technology and the processes of trade, but also created the conditions for empire, implicitly, not explicitly. So undoing apartheid requires a different approach. We have to firstly think that the aesthetic is not simply available to us. I know that there's a charge, a rush to ground on the aesthetic as the only way for us to think about how to live beyond the points of the violence of the contemporary. But I want to say that it is important for us to reckon with how the aesthetic had been conscripted through a sensory order to an execution of forms of power. And this is a form of routine violence, what Gyan Pandey calls routine violence, not the event of history, not the event of apartheid that was featured at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that had victims and perpetrators. This is a form of violence where victims and perpetrators are almost indistinguishable, where cause and effect are pretty much indistinguishable. And I want to ask us to attend to this. So in the Center for Humanities Research, we established a project to try and think about what it might mean to hold on to this idea of the consilience of induction, but to invert its potential. And we came up with what is called the Iatsiba Lab. Now, I'm losing sight of I've lost all my slides. Anyway, you'll forgive me. You're going back. I'm going back. That's the story of my life. So, historically black university that was denied any arts education, and here you can see the resonances of Verwoerd's orchestration of apartheid. What we decided was to build, to refurbish an old school, a whites-only school in the heyday of apartheid in the city center, to build a project that would put movement at the heart of thought. So to bring about a way of thinking our way through the problem of stasis. And we introduced three aesthetic objects into this conversation. The one is the puppet, a kinetic object with a group of young people who had been trained by Handspring Puppet Company from Masiphumelele Township and built their own Ukwanda Puppetry and Design Collective, and worked with the rural community to create conditions of movement between rural, peri-urban, and urban, to break out of the geographies of apartheid, because apartheid had trapped young people in its geographies, and immobility is the condition where petty apartheid is beginning to show up almost in the everyday. So this is a space for movement through the kinetic object. The second object is the documentary film moving image, partly because as a port city, Cape Town had a vast cinematic tradition. But also the cinematic language was introduced into society through psychophysics and psychotechnics because it was seen as an industrial technology. The first work on cinema studies is Hugo Munsterberg's photoplay, written in 1917. It was an attempt to see how Paramount Pictures, and he's employed by Paramount Pictures to find a way to bring the working class into this, into a numbing of the senses, if you like, and into a place where docility becomes the order of a social existence. And then the third project is around sound, because in a port city, the way in which sound operates, but also to think about how anecdote might permeate the city and break up these geographies of this divided city that has taken hold. And so these three orchestrations have become very important ways for us to think about what it means to return the hand to the work of the university, how to bring the apprenticeship prospects into the Socratic and scholastic formations of the university and shift the idea of the university beyond the kind of parameters that apartheid had constituted for it. And so I'm going to just show you a few, there's a video, there are more slides as well. And there's more to say on this, but I'm not going to, because I think I've run out. This is a project with the rural community each year that we run, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. So we're involved in a project now with Nizar Zouabi, who is responsible as the artistic director for Little Amal. Some of you might have encountered it. We built the prototypes for a herd of 600 to 1,000 life-size animal puppets that are marching from Kinshasa to Norway on a climate change project. They're now in Morocco at the moment. And I'm going to show you just one or two clips from what's come out, and then we can think about whether I've persuaded you sufficiently that apartheid was completely misunderstood, or perhaps largely misunderstood, and that we need another orientation to think our way out of the predicaments that it leaves us with. That now belongs to the world. We certainly don't want to own it. It is precisely the worry about stasis that we ought to attend to. In fact, global apartheid is the problem of stasis. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Before I get you here and I invite Huda, do you want to just do a small piece of infomercial to let everyone know?
No, yes. I was going to say that, I'm really bad at advertising. But the herds are on their way to London in June and then off to Manchester. So they're leaving Morocco in a week and to Madrid, through Spain, through France, and then they'll come to London, Manchester, and then off to Norway to the Arctic Circle. Nizar, it's done in conjunction with University College Arts London. So we did the prototypes. Ukwanda did. I like saying we because I'm not allowed in the lab actually. But the prototypes were built by Ukwanda, and they had to use materials that could be found everywhere. So cardboard is the material that has been decided on. And David Land is the producer. Nizar Zouabi, the artistic director, and University College Arts London have multiplied the herd from the prototypes that were sent. It's a massive operation, completely counterintuitive because it doesn't work from machine to aesthetic object. It works with sculpting and then translation through a process of photogrammetry that gets sent to the UK, where the arts students were not good enough to build this stuff. So they had to be given lots of instructions. But I'm going to stop there because I'm going to get into trouble.
Please, I'd love to.
Thank you.
I just want to say we tried very hard to have a puppet in the room or outside. The dates proved impossible, but we're working on it. Maybe at some point we will have
David Land is very interested.
How can we know the specific dates?
Herds.org. If we just
It's just on the
herds.org. Oh, yes. So while maybe Primesh is getting a sip of water and you gathering your thoughts, thank you both, Huda and Primesh, extremely dense and I don't know, like talks that really activated the imagination. So thank you for that. Just 1 second of housekeeping. So we have our colleagues and participants online. I'm leaving it to Sriya to have the responsibility to gather the questions and thoughts that come from that space, and she will have the microphone to share those questions. Just as a matter of procedure, to invite people who have questions or comments to wait for the microphone, because this has implications for how people can hear us online. So that's just the protocol. So I had the privilege to actually work through some movements of the density of both your arguments and your discussion. So I'm going to take the liberty and the privilege to maybe focus maybe 2 starting points to reorient the question of research. And what struck me as really immediate was the issue of method as it pertains to research, and the inquiry around how method actually constitutes the knowledge-making modality, for want of a better word, the knowledge-making modality in which then knowledge comes to be expressed. So whether it's in the form of sort of the evocation, and Huda, I'm going to just, these are more opening comments, and then both of you can take them in the direction you want. But I was struck by sort of a particular kind of insistence on fiction as method, given the fact that as we know also, Primesh, if I stitch, using your phrase now, stitch back your talks in relation to each other, that in many ways the project of sort of apartheid through these cyber technologies is also one of creating a set of fictions. So there's this idea of fiction as method seems to me to also trouble the question of what constitutes fiction in relation to the idea of the empirical project of the university. And I make this insistence because research, in order to ground its insistence and its veracity, is so dependent on the question of method and the methodological implications in which knowledge is then expressed. So I just, maybe that's a starting point, because we've been invited to this very demanding question of research now and what to do in this moment. So before we even go to what to do, the question of interrogating research and its methodological frameworks.
Is this on? Yeah. So, look, I mean, I was trying to orient some of what I was saying to this question of what is research now. And I think there is something about the consilience of inductions that was profoundly important for the revolutions in thermodynamics in the 19th century. There's no getting out of the scientific revolution. But there is something to be said about how it got reoriented towards a certain kind of political rationality in apartheid. So what we've done, and I might have not mentioned this, is in naming this laboratory, Iatsiba, which in Xhosa means it is jumping, is to think about this idea of knowledge jumping from one field to another to produce a surprise. Because that's what Darwin and Herschel are in a conversation about. There's a wonderful opera that's done by Yvette Christianse and Ross Morris on the meeting that happened at Feldhausen in the 1830s. But, you know, evolutionary biology is not observable. It's the laws of physics that were applied by Darwin to the space of evolutionary biology that produces a certain kind of modernity that we inhabit now. There's no getting out of that script. I mean, we are locked in it in all sorts of ways, including in some of its most violent expressions. But what the Iatsiba lab is trying to ask for is a different way of engaging the sensory. Firstly, by tackling the sensory order as a political form. And secondly, by asking whether there's a way of veering away from this effect of the Trojan horse. So that, you know, what the anxiety of the present is that, you know, we are everywhere faced with a Trojan horse that we've either monumentalized or turned into a source of great admiration. And yet it's a war machine. And so the thing here is to find a vocabulary that gets us away from this repetitiveness, the repetitive encounter with this war machine. So that's one thing I would say about method, is not to reinvent method or to go up against the sciences, but to ask what in the sciences might offer other ways and other metaphors for thinking about the human conditions, species, the planet, and so on and so forth. And then I just say one small thing on fiction. I mean, I'm drawing on Gayatri Spivak's aesthetic education, and the call for an aesthetic education that Spivak has posed to us and challenged us with is not simply a Schillerian kind of repetition. It's not Schiller's 19th century essay on an aesthetic education for man. In fact, what Spivak wants us to do is to think about sensory training as a fundamental place to begin thinking about constituting new ways of relationality in the world, particularly where that relationality exists only through conditions of stasis now. I mean, that's the post-apartheid will be fine as long as we're all comfortable. And the word culture now codes race in all sorts of ways. So suddenly when 49 Africa, and I don't know what this even means, get taken to Trump land, suddenly, stasis is threatened, And it's that worries me. Like, why should that stasis be approached with that kind of restorative sensibility? Like, why do we want to restore stasis when in fact stasis is precisely the mode of operation of apartheid? That's apartheid.
I think that the question of fiction is a really interesting one, because it is about questioning both of these lines, and where the line between history and fiction lies, and recognizing that it's constantly being mediated, and it really depends on how you're reading it. But I think that what this project is asking is, what does it mean to really look at that? I guess to look at what are the kinds of stories that we tell about these spaces, and to recognize archival fiction is to open up a space of possibility for reading that archive differently, and to understand the implications of that on architecture specifically. So I think, I think that of course it's not. It is about a question of power and how power operates. It's not to say that all fictions fiction is also embedded within power relations. But I think the question of, I think for me, a lot of this comes from this question of how this project really comes out of having been taught architecture at the University of Cape Town, where we are being consistently taught to venerate these buildings, and really, it was really in that particular novel. I mean, I think there's others that do similar things, but it really is, it's a combination of the way that Yvette Christianse writes and the novel itself. So it's the form of writing and the form of narration that kind of really just switched something for me in terms of what does it mean to return both to the buildings and to the archives. And I think it opens up a set of questions which really ask us to contend with the violence of the discipline of architecture as, at its core, one of really constructing the idea of South Africa and constructing it within as a kind of white space, but in the present to actually ask, well, if that is the way that we've inherited architecture as a discipline, how do we begin to undo this? And I don't think, and I think, the project that Pramesh is talking about, I think, is really about projecting towards that, and I'm kind of still opening up this space in this one. But it is work that I think architecture is very hesitant to do because of its imbrication within patronage networks and economies of construction. And especially in a place like South Africa, where actually, although I don't think this is limited to that, I think this is a bigger project, there's a kind of, so I think it's a similar thing of how do we move to another discipline to ask these questions back of the space that, to ask if we read fiction as architectural history, what does this do for us as architects? But also, how do we then dismantle these things, and what are the other ways in which we can think about spatial constructions or understanding of spaces? And I think also the kinds of both the kinds of narrative techniques and stories that enable certain histories to be present, but also the kinds of bodies and the life of these buildings in the many ways.
Okay, so I'm going to just perhaps shepherd us in one more direction, and then we'll open to the floor. What struck me again as a sort of something to bring both the talks together was kind of the attention to certain kinds of differentiated moves between sort of the collapse of victim and perpetrator, which we know so well in South Africa through these gestures of petty apartheid, where we, and I say we because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was this radical sort of act and encounter. And the word I want to introduce into this strategically is the notion of bearing witness. And I'm attending to this particular term because I think it ties into something that Huda was referring to in these acts of ghosts. And why I'm particularly interested in this is because there's a way in which we think of the ghost, and sort of you've also sort of, there's almost, it's impossible to have a talk without actually activating the goddess of Gayatri Spivak. So let's spend a moment with her. So if we take a moment to just attend to how these sort of ideas of the subaltern speak to the idea of the aesthetic education, but this very important separation between witnessing, the idea that actually there are acts of looking, there are acts of seeing, which are different from looking, and this separation also of the gaze. So the ghost might be there, but cannot be seen, but we witness the experience, or at least there is a witnessing of that experience through the way in which these legends and myths are told. And I think it would be useful to just spend some time, because both of you, in some ways in your talks, are talking about these very acute differentiations between ghosts that cannot be seen but are there, the idea that the subaltern can never speak but is actually can, in the quote that you offered, she is not be able to look up, but at the same time, she can see because she is witness in many ways to the lives, the interior lives of the way in which, let's say, what I would call the way in which we as brown bodies witness, and black bodies are witness to white lives, actually. The internal domestic spaces that we inhabit when we are invisible, to clean, to move, to tend to your plants. We are the ones tending to your plants in these gardens. And so I'm thinking about your sort of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there is also the demand to see, to look, the witnessing, which is in some ways speaks, I think, very closely to this idea of a search for an aesthetics of a post-apartheid. Or maybe a non-racialized futurity that we can only imagine in our inner eye. Perhaps it's all too ocular, and you can say, Jyoti, I have no interest in what you're going in, and you can abandon that.
All right, let me try. I mean, as you were unfolding that question, I kept thinking there are various ways I would traverse that. Look, the question of subalternity for me is about subaltern effect, and I was thinking about inhabitation rather than, so this is where Hall's, free-floating signifier is very useful in unmooring it from its biological kind of, unmooring it from its biological kind of attachment, as with, up here. What Hall gives us an opportunity to think is how the movement from signifier to signified is never complete with the subaltern subject. So, Goa has that wonderful line about the subaltern stutters in its articulation. And, it's in that notion of stuttering that I find the most productive way to be in an engagement in a dialogue with the subaltern effect. And so that's where I've been trying to insist that perhaps, beyond the moment when we were all fascinated with how we're going to represent, what we ought to be thinking about is the stutter of articulation, because it seems to me that is where subalternity is extremely productive. I would also just want to I think Huda was making the point about linearity, but we have to ask ourselves, what does the 19th and 20th century geometrically look like from the 21st century? And I would say that, that Ubu and the Truth Commission, that reproduction of that play by by Alfred Jarry, Ubu Hua, you'll remember there's the spiral. And I keep thinking, that the spiral is an incredibly important motif for thinking about the world that we inhabit. So rather than linearity, it's the spiral, because it also has all the fantasies of the machinic, of springing, of jumping, all of those. So the spiral could become an important motif to guide a concept of research, partly because beginnings and ends are inadequate in the kind of conceptualization of the spiral. So I'm trying to think about what are the modalities through which we think. Stuttering might be one, the spiral, and all of these are not drawn out of any particular systematic thought. It's drawn out of an engagement with an aesthetic object, like the puppet that is put into motion. I keep thinking about the coupling handspring, and Kentridge's resort again and again to the spring. If you look at all his work, there's always a replaying of the kind of spiral as a form. So just that's at the level of form. And I think that we might want to ask what it means to shift perspectively where we look at the world from, which kind of geometric forms we look at the world from.
So maybe before we get to Huda, I think it's important to respond to the fact that the spiral offers, I think, an important intervention into the linearity of history. And perhaps that intervention is that aesthetic expression, which is what I was kind of trying to intimate in these separations, because the witness, the act of looking, as Mitsov would say, is about a recognition of the violation or violence, or an attempt to move out of certain registers of violence. Huda, maybe it's...
I think I'll pick up first on this question of the time, because I think for me, in kind of listening or trying to find this ghost in the archives, who is an incredibly elusive figure, or not only in the archives, but in kind of returning to the buildings. It's also, I think, thinking about a conversation that we had, I think it's also about this question of recognizing that for so many of us, I think, as you said, with witnessing, time is not linear anyway. And so, when we think in academic terms, there is this kind of imposition of linearity in relation to how we're taught to understand history and time and our place in it. But I think that, and I'm referring to the conversation when you asked about, but what about this, like, why the ghost in a particular sense of, I think even that term ghost, and really that term comes from this particular late 19th, early 20th century archives. But these beings or presences, or we spoke about the jinn, the bibwengo, are these creatures, I think, who are really part of how we, if we take them really seriously, how part we understand life as continuous. And I think and so in a way, this, it is, I'm not sure that we have to give it a geometric form, maybe coming from architecture and being particularly wary of that. But I think it is about that kind of, that it is definitely a question of perspective, and actually that it is not it is about who cares to hear, which is Fair Bridges, because some of us might visit these sites and not have a sense of that depth of history. But many of us do, and many of us, and I think in South Africa, again, that's a very common thing, like places we don't go to, places we avoid in a very everyday sense of, I think especially in a city like Cape Town. So I think I think the question's really interesting of these different forms of the ocular, but also for me, what is at the heart of this question of asking how we think with the ghost for architecture is also to it's not only about listening, but there is a form of witnessing that is not verbal, that is non-verbal, that is about this unspeakable, that is about that below the surface, and that architecture in its disciplinary forms has become a visual form. So we, especially in education, where you represent things visually, and that becomes the primary mode of translation. But I think that part of my interest is how do we find other ways of understanding space and spatial inhabitation, I guess, but also a different, and I think that they are there in the places as well. It's not like I think it's about kind of returning as much.
Can I just add one small thing to Huda? I mean, it is about doubling. And subalternist perspective, I mean, I'm thinking about Freud's psychopathologies of everyday life, when he leaves his study and enters Vienna, the streets of Vienna, he encounters the slip of the tongue. It's that double future. I mean, they're all over. An anecdote, he has been completely quarantined in the city. So you can't find the language infiltrating the kind of angry divide, if you like. In fact, it's become harder now to hear, to listen in, and that's what I heard you saying. So that a doubling effect, as where you start thinking about what post-apartheid freedom might mean, look like, is something that we ought to be engaged in some respect. Because I think what we're trying to figure out is the subaltern as a politicized ontology of the subject. And I think that as soon as you get there, you realize that subject is, by virtue of apartheid being apartheid, has been fractured and fragmented to the extent that it is no longer possible to conceive of the whole without thinking of it simply as a condition of stasis. If that makes sense. So I'm saying,
absolutely,
like,
but
you've got to move
maybe
this thing along somehow,
But just to then finish that part, because then we'll open it to the floor, because I'm sure there's so many questions and observations and reflections. I think there's something really important in what you've said about this idea of the fractured being, in which the only way to witness is precisely not to necessarily have that, but the sensorial. To be present in the sensorial would be the act of witnessing this fracture, right? Okay, so the three South Africans can definitely commiserate on our past quite eloquently, I think, but perhaps there are thoughts and observations. Yes, please, and I will pass this along. Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ella.
Thank you so much. Just thinking about the overlaps between your presentations, Huda, the comment that you made about the violence of architecture also really made me think about the language of photography and the violence within that, not just the term shoot, but now I'm thinking about still as well, and stillness and stasis being entwined. I recently encountered this quote about crumbling being a process, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about your engagement with buildings also as moving, because that's kind of part of the pretense of architecture, like public sculptures and statues, that they're still forever. So maybe just a bit to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that of course buildings are not static in any sense, and that's also one of these kind of fictions of architecture which I think happens in a kind of disciplinary sense, of which you design. There's one person who designs this building, and then it gets built, and that's the design. And I think so I guess part of this project is a question of how do we find the language to speak about these sites, and not necessarily these ones. I think for me this project is really around how do we contend with this historical moment, how this moment of the origins of architectural history, both in South Africa, but also to understand it as part of wider and ongoing coloniality and relations to settler coloniality that are very close in and can be traced very closely. But I think, but beyond that, it's really, there's what the figure of the ghost tells us, even in these cases, is there is this constant circularity or return that, and I think these excerpts, both in the fictional text and in the are around contending with that these buildings have a life that is not just, that is both the occupants, but it's also it's a kind of we can talk about it from the kind of labor of constructing them to the labor of inhabiting and maintaining them, to the connection to the gardens and the kinds of maintenance and ongoing kind of worlds that inhabit them. And yeah, I think there's a lot more to say on that, but that would be my kind of response. Are there any questions on that? Oh, yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed those talks here.
I hope they're not coming first.
I really enjoyed talks. I wonder, we were talking about in the first lecture about the possibility of the void, the possibility of the invisible in the void, and the other lecture brought us to the mobility and the movement from status. I wonder if there is another word that we have to throw into the discussion here, and it's animation. Maybe animation is also a kind of a method that we can think about it in history and, of course, in art, as we saw here with Kentridge. But animation itself, animation also will bring us into the fiction that you were talking about. So I'm just thinking of another thing that one could drop into the discussion in. But I want to thank you for illuminating a lecture that put even now the whole history of art history from the mid of the 19th century up to today through your eyes into a huge critical way of looking at how art developed. And I'm thinking now to call Owen John's petty ornament and to think and looking what is the possibility of surrealism that we are actually avoiding speaking about it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, it's a great comment to kind of get us to think a little bit about what it means to create some distance between subject and object, to rethink this relationship again. I mean, that's what I find so fascinating, the puppet, is that in the Bunraku tradition that Handspring adopts, and it also draws on the Sogolon theatre from Mali, the great tradition of Yaya Coulibaly, who's now set up the Sogolon theatre, and then Handspring's own interventions, and now gone into making animal puppets more than, is the question of breath and how you breathe life into an object and how you keep the object alive on stage. So that's the first thing that we do here, is the work of observation is actually to figure out ways of animating the object. And it is important because if immaterial labor, and I know that's a contested term, given Negri and their spin on it, but if that is now what late capitalism is giving us with technical objects, we're going to have to find other ways of relating to objects. If we think that the sensory needs to be kept in play in the world. And so I think there's something about Kentridge's work in interpolating the puppet into a kind of conversation that becomes important. I also think that there's something I wanted to say earlier, that theatre, the Greeks had this notion of theatrocracy. And it is interesting that theatrocracy is where the spectator was invited into the production, into the play, to adjudicate the end of a tragedy. It's mainly Sophoclean in its origins, if I understand Samuel Weber correctly. But there's something about the theatre and theatricality, which is not merely performative, but is the site to work out relations between subjects and objects and shifting materialities and so on. And I think we've given up too prematurely on the idea of the theatrocracy by despairing about the failures of democracy now. And I think we ought to perhaps resurrect that. And perhaps the animation is the kind of modality for thinking about what theatre can do for us now.
Thank you all. This is incredibly inspiring to listen to. And I, as soon as you said animation, I was thinking that's the word I've been looking for in a way. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about, because I think there's also a question of what animates what. I mean, when I was looking especially at the Kentridge performances, I was so struck as much by the humans and the ways they have to move and the ways they're kind of becoming animal-like and so. I mean, in order to make those objects work, and sort of what that shifting of the human in a way because of this sort of working with the objects tells us. And the other thing, I'm not quite sure how to formulate this exactly, but I guess I'm a little curious what concept of fiction is at work here. We often talk about narratives as being linear and so on, but I'm really hard put to think of any narrative that's actually linear. Right? It's a very powerful idea, but then you look at histories, novels, they never, even the most conventional narrative, there appeals to the past, there are flashbacks, they have to manipulate time all over the place. And that question to me then is of fiction also is in its roots of the idea of making something, right? And I'm very struck just in doing research of very often finding different pieces of things and thinking about relationships and trying to construct a text in which those different pieces start to make a kind of sense, and really discovering something that I wasn't expecting through that making in a way, which in a weird way then takes me back to Kentridge and all these different parts that are always somehow awkwardly and deliberately awkwardly working together, that somehow out of that something was created. One last thing, just had to say, in your first talk, that wonderful moment of the landscape, also thinking of animation, is the house, I think it's the house you're talking about that isn't really placed in the landscape, but it's the way the path doesn't lead to the house, but it's sort of pushing out as if the house itself were reconstructing the landscape as well. It seemed to be also animating the land. Anyway, I'm not sure if any of this falls together, but...
Sorry, I'm interrupting you mostly because I see there was one more question. We'll take that or comment, and then if I could invite Huda and Pramesh to address that question, and then wrap up. Because we had we had just the one more. Sorry, Ella. Yeah, if we could just take those two. Did you not have your hand up? Yeah.
Thank you both for these wonderful talks. Sort of building a little bit on this question of the puppetry and sort of the animation there, I'm really struck also by the dichotomy between sort of the individual, the search for the individual in the archive, the ghost, the saving of that one child, and the sort of search for identity of individuals within, like also the anonymity of the groups or the larger groups within the archive, and then the communality, this sort of group project of that amazing, of the herds, right, where those puppets move only because they're being moved by multiple individuals together and sort of moving through the landscape. And I'm just wondering a little bit about how this fits sort of in your thoughts on post-apartheid South Africa and in your search for the archive, how you resolve or grapple with this tension between the individual and the communities within them.
So could I invite both of you to respond to those two, and we have two more questions online. Yeah, sure. Perhaps brief.
Thank you. Those are great questions. Maybe I'll start with the second one. So I think it's a really interesting question around where you find the individual versus the communal in this ghost figure. So on the one hand, I think at the heart of the novel by Yvette Christianse is the search for this name, and it is a kind of reparative project in terms of trying to understand who were these people and what does it mean to be able to find something about their lives. But on the other hand, you know, the figure of Sila is never an individual. She's actually always standing in for, both in the sense of how the narrative works itself, and I think that goes to your question, she's always standing in for the many women who she could have been, but even in that archival search, the impossibility of actually tracing who she is and where she comes from, and there's the slippage in that she was potentially maybe from Mozambique, but actually ends up having the name from the Cape, is already kind of tells you that, you know, we don't really know, and so that in itself, I guess, you know, it's. So I think it is about. I think my reading of this is that it's an attempt to kind of understand how we think across these modalities, rather than only the communal or the collective versus the individual, because there is no individuality, but there is also no kind of, I think there is also a question of what does the communal mean, and I think that's I would say that that's a question that translates into post-apartheid South Africa as well, in terms of how communal identities are understood, or as often as continuations of particular ways of understanding apartheid identities, but then are also kind of sometimes with limitations on how they can be remade, but also are reproduced in particular ways.
I mean, they're great questions, and I know my colleagues back home. I think one of the two of them might be online. They've been screaming at me about, you know, going on about the difference between science fiction and magical realism, because I actually don't know what the difference is. But there's something about Danby's painting and the apocalyptic sublime that seems to be the aesthetic register in which we think about the contemporary. So even in the way in which, you know, you think about questions of climate change and so on, that's the register that comes to mind. The aesthetic register is the apocalyptic sublime. And I keep thinking about, you know, what Marquez and Rushdie and others did with the post-colonial, which looked like it was in a descending, you know, it was descending into a kind of into the depths of despair. That what you could do with magical realism is reconstitute a different way of thinking difference and so on. So there's something to be worked out there. I mean, I'm always interested in the question of whether we could think this matter of doubling. And it comes from Du Bois, you know, Cells of Blackfur, the idea of double consciousness. But it is true from, his biographer mentions that he goes to see Faust too in 1893. And he walks out of that theater and he's horrified. So the split subject of Europe between intellect and desire, for Du Bois, that looks like race coming back in a new form. And all the belief that education was going to get you out of the pitfalls of slavery, 100 years later was beginning to look like a nightmare of a recurrency. And so the question here of race and its uncanny returns is something to think very carefully about. And here, you know, none of the figurations of, say, Gestalt debates in Germany between Berlin and Leipzig, which these South Africans were involved in. Smuts and Verwoerd are involved in the debate between holism and atomistic parts. That's, in fact, apartheid is a response to Smuts' holism. So you get a sense of the kind of technical modalities of organizing societies administratively. And the best critique of this is Siegfried Krakauer. The two books that he wrote, Ornamental Society and The Salaried Masses. I think that what was set up in South Africa was an underclass who were overseen by a poor white that was given individuality, access to the appreciations of bourgeois culture, and who looked with utter disdain on that class that they were actually bonded to by processes of work and labor and social life and so on. So I think there's something about how those formulations played out in the world, Gestalt debates, you know, and where the post-colonial got marked by those in very profound ways.
We have 2 questions online. I know we have to wrap up. Yeah, but maybe, Sriya, thank you so much for bringing the online people.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. I'm just going to say that there's similar questions. I'll ask them together. They're fairly long. But I think we have actually talked about both these questions in different ways, so kind of brief answers and then we'll close. So the first one is mostly for Huda. How can we responsibly engage with the ghost stories and spectral presences tied to colonial architecture without romanticizing or depoliticizing the histories of violence they evoke? And then the second one is, what are the potential methodological implications of omitting South African scientists, architects, and artists in the reimagined methodological framework? And what is the attempt to witness, document, and archive the future ghosts and the machines all around you now?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess maybe the first one is directly for me, and I think it's important to know. I don't see these ghostly figures that I'm looking at as in any way part of a romanticizing gesture. I think if anything, it's actually returning to these houses with the ghost is to think through the political and the economic and the judicial landscape within which these houses and their histories are constructed.
And very quickly from me, I mean, where we act is in the realm of the speculative. I mean, it's interesting that where Herschel built his telescope to map the southern skies, Amazon has now built its monstrosity, which is a hideous testimony to architecture. I mean, but they built it right on the space where not only was Dalmaida defeated in 1510 by the Portuguese, but also where this great conversation about the modern science kind of surfaced between Darwin and Herschel. So that testifies to something that was unleashed at the end of slavery. And it reminds me of Marx's writing about this line from Goethe's Faust, which is sung in a tavern called Auerbach's Tavern in Leipzig, of all places. And it's about a rat that dies with a smile on its face, as if its body is by love possessed. And it comes out of a exchange between this cook who's gone completely ballistic about this rat and poisons the rat. Marx sees that, he translates that from the pronoun he given to the rat to it, because this is the labor being taken up by capital in its most sensuous forms, he argues, in its most sensuous form, and given over to the monstrosity of capital. So this is why the struggle to hold on to the senses is absolutely critical in the work of research, and that we cannot simply see it as a way of marshalling it towards these orders that have been constituted from the 1830s down to the present, that somehow there must be a release for the sensory so that it can do a different kind of work in our time.
And on that, I'd like to say thank you to both of you and to you for being a captive audience. Thank you so much.